I'm Lauren Briggs, 40 years old, and I've spent the last 16 years in the United States Navy, from junior officer to Carrier Strike Group Command. For most of those years, my family believed I'd left the service after a short enlistment and taken a desk job in government administration. I let them believe that. I never corrected them. I just kept showing up to the things that mattered: birthdays, holidays, Derek's graduation from high school, Derek's college years, and finally, the day he'd earned something I'd never attempted myself: his Trident. Have you ever been standing in the room that should be your proudest moment for someone you love and still felt invisible? If so, drop your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I tell you what happened at that ceremony, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stay quiet while someone sold you short, and then let the truth do the talking, hit that like button and subscribe. My father's commendation certificate hung in the front hallway of our house on Crestfield Drive for as long as I can remember. It was framed in dark wood, mounted between the coat hooks and the side table where we dropped our keys, and it read, in the careful, formal language of official recognition, that firefighter Gregory Allen Briggs had demonstrated exceptional bravery under conditions of extreme danger in the performance of his duty, and that his actions reflected great credit upon himself and the San Diego Fire Rescue Department. I could recite it by heart before I was 7 years old. I used to run my finger along the frame the way other kids trace the spines of books, not to read but to feel something solid and decided and permanently true. My father found me doing this once when I was about 6, tracing the words I already knew by memory, and he picked me up and held me against his chest and told me what it meant. He said someone needed help, and you went. He said that was all there was to it. I believed him then. I believe him still. I just spent the next 34 years discovering that the definition he handed me in that hallway was considerably larger than the category he thought he was describing. I grew up in a household where service meant physical presence under physical risk. My father went into burning buildings. His colleagues went into burning buildings. His brother, my Uncle Dennis, was a paramedic who worked night shifts in a city that never fully quieted, who came to our holiday dinners smelling of antiseptic and strong coffee and sometimes didn't finish his plate because he'd gotten a call on the drive over and had already rerouted twice. The men my father admired most, the people he spoke about at dinner with the particular warmth he reserved for genuine respect, were men who used their bodies as instruments of protection, who stood physically between people and the thing trying to hurt them. There was a clarity to this framework that I valued even as a child. It was consistent, deeply held, and morally serious. What it wasn't, although I wouldn't understand this for many years, was complete. There were other forms of service, slower moving, less visible, not indexed to bodily endurance or physical courage in any way the certificate in our hallway had been designed to recognize, that carried the identical, essential quality my father had described to me at 6 years old. Someone needs help, and you go. I found that out in a different kind of building, wearing a different kind of uniform, doing work my father could not see from Crestfield Drive. I was a reader, which my father respected without quite knowing what to do with. My mother taught 6th grade English and bought me books the way other parents bought sports equipment, with intention and regularity and the genuine assumption that the investment would compound. I was quiet at school, precise in the way that comes from paying attention to detail over a long time, good at languages and at parsing structures of cause and consequence. By my sophomore year of high school, I kept a notebook in the bottom drawer of my desk that I had been filling since I was 14. Pages of research, admission statistics, rank structures, what the alumni pages at various academies said about the lives that followed from their gates. I was planning. I was doing it alone, methodically, without announcing it, which in retrospect was a preview of the next 20 years. My father saw me at the desk occasionally when he came to say goodnight. He asked if I was doing homework. I said yes. He ruffled my hair and went back down the hall. It was not a dishonest answer. When I was 17, a Naval Academy recruiter came to my high school's college fair and stood at a table near the gymnasium exit. I was there for the UC Berkeley booth and the Pomona booth, and I walked past the USNA table 3 times before I stopped. The recruiter was a young lieutenant in service dress blues, the all-navy uniform, gold stripes, ribbons on the chest, with the quietly settled quality of someone who had been somewhere difficult and come back knowing what she was made of. She answered my first 3 questions precisely and without filler. She answered a 4th one I hadn't asked. Most people who go through this leave knowing exactly who they are. I filled out the application that same night at the kitchen table. My father's response when I told him over dinner was brief and practical. He said Annapolis was in Maryland. He said it was far. He didn't say anything about what it might mean for his daughter to commission as a naval officer, or what the intelligence track might produce or require, or whether the life on the other side of that particular door was one that suited me. He said it was a long way. My mother said they would come for graduation. I cleared my plate and thanked them. I was going regardless. Jake was born 12 years after me in the spring of 1998. I was in 7th grade. I sat in the hospital waiting room with a library book I couldn't concentrate on, and the specific feeling that something permanent was about to happen. When they let me hold him, I sat still for 45 minutes, and he looked at my face with the focused uncertainty of an infant trying to determine if this particular face in the world was worth tracking. I decided in that room that I would be good to him. It was a decision I made deliberately and kept. On my breaks from Annapolis, I got up with him on Saturday mornings so my parents could sleep in. I read him books about ships and ocean navigation and the names of whales. When he was 4 years old, I told him he could be anything he put his mind toward. He informed me, very seriously, that he was going to be a Navy man. I laughed. I did not tell him I had known since the waiting room. What happened in the years between Jake's birth and my commissioning was simple and undramatic. The family's center of gravity reorganized around him, as families do, and I was old enough that this cost me very little in the short term. I had my notebook, I had the recruiter's sentence. I had the organizing principle my father had given me in the hallway, which I was quietly aiming at a target he couldn't see. Jake got taller. He ran faster than anyone expected. He was 6 years old when I left for Annapolis, standing in the driveway waving at the car until we turned the corner. I looked back through the rear window and thought, he's going to be fine. I was right about that part. The Naval Academy takes 18-year-olds who believe they understand what hard means and spends 4 years demonstrating, with systematic precision, that they do not. I was not exceptional in this regard. I arrived believing I was prepared and learned that preparation and readiness are different things, and the difference is almost exclusively discovered under pressure. I was selected for the intelligence track during my junior year. I graduated in 2008, shook the superintendent's hand, and was commissioned Ensign of the United States Navy at 22 years old. I drove back to San Diego with my commission in a cardboard tube in the trunk and had dinner with my parents that night. My mother took photographs. My father grilled chicken and told everyone at the table that his daughter had commissioned. Jake, 10 years old, rendered a salute with the wrong hand and laughed until he choked on a roll. It was a good evening. I noticed that my father did not ask, at any point during that dinner, what I was actually going to do. He asked where I was stationed. He asked if the housing was good. He asked if I'd made friends. He did not ask what an intelligence officer in the United States Navy does on a Monday morning. I did not explain it. This was the first evening I understood clearly that the gap between us on this particular subject was structural rather than temporary, that it had been built from years of separate frameworks and would not close at a dinner table. I filed this away without comment. My first assignment was at Naval Warfare Systems Command in San Diego, 10 miles from Crestfield Drive. The Sunday dinners continued. They were warm and ordinary and entirely disconnected from what I was doing the other 6 days of the week, and I found this more manageable than I expected, for a long time. My work was not something I could describe at that table. Some of it was classified, and all of it required context that I had accumulated over years and could not hand across a pasta bowl in any efficient way. So I talked about the base, about the Silver Strand, about the people I worked with, in the general language of collegial warmth. My family did not push for more. They were not cold about it. They were not withholding interest deliberately. They were occupied with Jake's growing athletic career, with the rhythms of a household organized around a 10-year-old schedule, and with the comfortable assumption that if anything important were happening with Lauren would say. I did not say. I was learning a habit of silence that I would spend the next 18 years refining until the silence became so practiced that it looked like discretion and I forgot it had started as self-protection. I was promoted to lieutenant junior grade in 2010 and selected for the Naval Postgraduate School Intelligence Program. I called my mother on a Tuesday evening. She said that was wonderful, and I could hear Jake running in the yard outside and my father calling for him and the specific texture of a household that was full and moving and not quite listening. I said I'd call later. I was promoted to lieutenant in 2012, and assigned to an intelligence cell at Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, supporting SEAL Team 3. I was 26 years old and working at the operational junction of classified maritime operations and special warfare planning. I was reviewing intelligence products that shaped mission-level decisions for people who would be going somewhere dangerous within weeks. This was not desk work in any meaningful sense of the phrase. It had never been desk work. But the family's language for what I did had calcified by then into a phrase, Navy stuff, and I had stopped correcting it. And the phrase passed between us like a coin nobody had thought to examine in years. Jake was 15 in 2012, and he was exceptional at nearly everything physical. Football in the fall, wrestling in winter, competitive swimming in spring. He moved through organized athletics with the same focused ease I had recognized in him as an infant, the quality of someone who finds the body a reliable instrument and doesn't need to argue with it. My father went to every game. He put the programs on the refrigerator and the photographs on the bulletin board beside the garage door. He drove 3 hours through a January rainstorm to watch Jake wrestle in a tournament in Fresno. I attended SEAL Team 3's full deployment readiness reviews and wrote assessments that shaped operational planning in the Pacific Theater. At a family dinner that winter, my father asked me if I got to travel much for work. I said yes. He said that sounded nice. He passed the roles across to Jake and asked him to describe the Fresno tournament from the beginning. I deployed to Bahrain in 2013 for 7 months in support of classified maritime operations that I cannot describe in this setting. I came back in November with the specific exhaustion that comes from sustained attention to things that cannot be spoken about outside a secured facility, from months of carrying information whose weight is invisible to everyone outside the cleared world. I sat at the Thanksgiving table on Crestfield Drive with jet lag and an operational residue I had no vocabulary for with this particular audience. And Greg said it was good to have me home and asked if I'd seen any of the country while I was over there. I said a little. He nodded and told me Jake had been offered a scholarship to wrestle at San Diego State. Donna clapped. Greg told the story of Jake's final dual meet of the season in detail. The table lit with the particular energy it reserved for Jake's physical achievements, and I ate my pie. And I felt not quite resentment, but the quiet finality of a door completing its closing arc. I did not feel sorry for myself. I have never found self-pity useful. But I noted the finality of it. I understood that I was not going to be discovered by this table, that discovery, if it came, would have to come from somewhere else. I was promoted to lieutenant commander in 2014. I mentioned it at a family dinner in November. Greg was describing Jake's recent regional wrestling qualifier, a second-place finish by a single point, and I waited for the natural gap. I said over dessert that I'd been promoted. My father said that was terrific, honey, and turned to Jake to ask whether the third-place finisher had been the same kid from Riverside. The evening continued. I drove home and sat in my car in the parking lot for several minutes before going up. I want to be precise about what I felt, because it matters to the story. I was not devastated. I was categorized. I understood, with the particular clarity that arrives after asking the same implicit question long enough that it stops producing hope, that I occupied a fixed position in the family's accounting, the capable, quiet one, the one who got along fine, the one who did her work and came to dinner and did not need to be thought about. Jake occupied the other position, the exciting one, the physical one, the one whose achievements required immediate attention, because they were vivid and time-sensitive, and produced a specific kind of pride that my father recognized from his own career. Neither of these descriptions was wrong. They were just incomplete, and by 2014, the incompleteness had become so permanent that I stopped waiting for it to change. I moved into a senior role at Naval Special Warfare Command in 2016. Jake graduated high school that year and enrolled at UC San Diego in engineering. My father drove him to orientation. I came to a family dinner in September and found blue and gold UCSD streamers in the kitchen. I said it looked wonderful. No one had put up streamers in 2004 when I left for Annapolis, but I had stopped marking the asymmetries years before. What I focused on instead was Jake himself, because he was worth focusing on. Genuinely brilliant, socially easy in a way I had never been and did not envy exactly, capable of filling a room with warmth that cost him nothing and felt effortless. He started calling me late on Sunday nights from college after finishing engineering problem sets, and those calls were the best relationship we had in those years. He asked me real questions, and I answered them honestly, and neither of us mentioned, on those Sunday calls, anything about how the family accounting worked. We were, in those conversations, simply two people who genuinely liked each other and had always found it easiest to talk when the rest of the family wasn't present. I have not forgotten the value of those calls. I don't know if they would have continued the way they did if we'd had to navigate everything else at the same time. I was selected for commander in 2018. This was a significant marker, 05, the rank where the career divides between those who will move into senior leadership and those who won't. Achieved on the first look by fewer than half of eligible officers. I was a first look selection. I was assigned to Naval Special Warfare Command Staff in Coronado. I called my mother on a Tuesday evening. She said that was wonderful and asked if I could come to Sunday dinner. I said I'd try. That same week, Jake called the family to announce his intention to apply to the Navy SEAL program after graduation. He was 20 years old, 2 years into his engineering degree, and had been training toward this announcement for 3 years of deliberate physical preparation. My father's response was to throw a party, a Saturday afternoon gathering in the backyard on Crestfield Drive. A banner, a sheet cake, Jake's friends from UCSD who drove down for it, toasts. Greg stood at the center of the backyard with a beer in his hand and spoke about the Briggs spirit, about the kind of courage it takes to go after something that doesn't accept everyone, about how rare that quality is and how proud he was to see it in this family. He looked in my direction while he said it, with a warmth that might have been inclusive and might not have been. I could not tell, and I stopped trying to determine it a long time ago. I sat at that table in the backyard with my commander's selection notification folded in my jacket pocket. I had been selected early for a promotion fewer than half of my peers would achieve. There was a banner in the backyard for my brother's intention to someday try. I thought, this is the structure of this family, and it is not going to change. I drove back to Coronado that night. I sat in my car in the base parking lot for 7 minutes. Then I went inside and got back to the work, which was the only reliable constant in my life and which I was grateful for. The Trident pinning ceremony at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado took place on March 15, 2026. I was 40 years old. I was Captain Lauren Briggs, United States Navy, commanding officer of Naval Special Warfare Group 1, the command that encompasses SEAL teams 1, 3, 5, and 7 on the West Coast, along with support commands, training infrastructure, and logistics organizations totaling several thousand personnel across multiple installations. I had been in command for 2 years, following my early selection to captain at year 16 of my commissioned service, placing me in the exceptional selection bracket. I say this directly, without hedge. It took 20 years of sustained, precise, uncompromising professional work to reach that command. And the honest version of my story cannot be told without including that fact. AB Coronado is a base I know from the inside, its operational rhythms, its personnel culture, its daily tempo across deployment cycles. I have driven through the main gate hundreds of times without thinking about it the way someone who doesn't belong there might think about it. Without registering the weight of the institution around me, the way my father had been permitted to drive past it on the Strand Road for 20 years without ever stopping to ask what it was doing. I arrived at 0900 in my service dress blues, the uniform for a female officer at my rank. All navy jacket and matching trousers, 4 gold stripes on the sleeves, 1 broad, 3 narrow above it, the notation for captain at 06. My ribbons on the left breast, the Defense Superior Service Medal, the Meritorious Service Medal with Gold Star, the Joint Service Commendation Medal, the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal, and several others accumulated across 18 years of commissioned service in roles that I had been, for 18 years, too cautious, or too tired, or too well-trained in silence to explain to my family at dinner. I was one of several senior officers present that morning. The families arriving in their good clothes and carrying phones for photographs would not necessarily know what 4 gold stripes meant or why the Master Chiefs on the base pathway straightened when I passed. My family had never needed to learn that language. They did not know it that morning. My mother hugged me when they arrived. Donna has always hugged before assessing, which I have always found steadying about her. My father looked at my uniform and said I looked stiff and should relax because this was Jake's day. I said I was relaxed. He clapped me on the shoulder and moved off toward the staging area to find Jake. I stood in the pale morning light, coming off the Pacific with my hands folded in front of me. and watched the ceremony grounds fill with families and the specific compressed energy of people who have been working toward a moment for years and are now standing inside it. Commander Ryan Cole, commanding officer of the Naval Special Warfare Center Basic Training Command, presided. He was an 05 with 3 gold stripes and the particular economy of movement that develops in people who have spent years in special operations environments. The quality of someone who has learned not to use more motion than a situation requires. He was, in my command's chain of authority, an officer whose annual performance evaluation was submitted through my headquarters. He had briefed at NSWG-1 on multiple occasions. He knew my name, my face, my command, and my authority before he walked onto the grinder that morning. 22 newly qualified SEALs stood in formation on the concrete training area, facing their families across a cleared lane. Jake stood third from the left in his dress whites, jaw set, eyes forward. He looked like our father would have looked at 28, standing inside something large and earned and costly, still registering the weight of what he had just come through. I was proud of him. Not complicated pride, not pride with conditions attached to it. The clean, clear, uncomplicated kind. Commander Cole addressed the families and the assembled SEALs before the pinning. He spoke about what the Naval Special Warfare insignia represents, not merely the completion of a qualification process, but the ongoing commitment that the insignia ratifies, the responsibility it places on the wearer every single day for the duration of a career. He said the Trident is not an ending. He said it is a beginning that will cost something new every day from this morning forward, and that the cost is not a burden. It is a direction. I watched Jake's face as Cole said this and saw my brother absorb it with the specific stillness of someone who has already learned in the hardest available context what continuing to move when stopping is fully available looks like from the inside. He was ready. The families came forward for the pinning. Donna wept against my father's arm. Greg's chest expanded visibly, the unconscious pride posture that men who have spent careers in physical service develop for moments like this. I stood 2 steps behind them, watching my brother stand straight and composed as my mother pressed the Trident to his chest, and he became, officially and permanently, a Navy SEAL. It was a good moment. It was a real moment. I held it. The formal ceremony concluded. Families spread across the grinder for photographs. Jake was immediately surrounded, his team, his friends from the pipeline, his girlfriend Maya in a yellow dress, standing on her toes to put her arm around him. I was talking with a Master Chief I knew from a recent readiness review when I noticed my father break away from the group and cross the grinder toward Commander Cole, who was standing near the base flagpole reviewing something on his phone. My father has always been a man who finds it natural to introduce himself, who moves through rooms and events with the comfortable ease of someone who has spent decades building relationships through showing up. He was walking toward Cole with that ease. I was 20 feet away. I did not move toward them. I heard my father's voice carrying clearly across the morning air, a firefighter's voice trained for distance and noise. He said, "Excuse me, Commander. Just wanted to say, fine ceremony. My son Jake is one of your new men. Third from the left." He nodded toward where Jake was standing. Cole said something I couldn't hear. My father pointed in my direction. He said, "That's my daughter Lauren over there. She did a bit of Navy desk work. Nothing like Jake, but you know how it is." Commander Cole's smile faded. Not immediately, not dramatically, it left his face with the controlled precision of someone exercising discretion in real time. His eyes moved to my sleeve. He read the 4 gold stripes with the speed of someone who reads uniforms the way other people read name badges. His eyes moved to my ribbons. His expression shifted into the specific stillness of a person who has just received information that fundamentally reframes the last several minutes of conversation and is managing the recalibration without allowing it to become a scene. He took 1 step back from my father's side. He turned and crossed toward me without hesitation. 4 clean, deliberate steps across the concrete. He stopped in front of me. He stood straight. "Captain Briggs," he said, clearly, loud enough for the families standing in a 10-foot radius to hear it without effort. "Ma'am, it's an honor." The Master Chief beside me came to attention in the reflexive, immediate way of someone responding to the specific combination of rank and context. 2 of the newly pinned SEALs standing within earshot turned to look. I said, "Thank you, Commander. Fine ceremony." My voice was easy. He said, "Enjoy the day, ma'am. and moved smoothly on toward the next family. I stood where I was for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Jake had broken from his group across the grinder and was walking toward us. He had seen the exchange from 30 feet away, and his face had the specific processing quality of someone connecting information that had been held separately for years. Maya was beside him in the yellow dress. My mother had turned from wherever she was standing, drawn by the sound of Commander Cole's address, and she was looking at my sleeve with an expression I could not name exactly, something between the recognition of a thing you should already know and the specific bewilderment of finding you don't. My father had not moved from near the flagpole. He was not looking at me. He was looking at his own hands, clasped in front of him, and his posture had changed. The easy, room-filling confidence of a man who goes where he belongs had shifted into something smaller and more uncertain. I watched him stand like that for a few seconds. Then Jake reached me and put his hand on my shoulder and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing. Donna crossed to us and touched my arm. Greg stayed where he was. We let him be. I looked at my father, the same practiced efficiency with which he had handled everything that morning. I looked at my father. He was looking at my sleeve. He was looking at 4 gold stripes, the way a man looks at something he has passed 100 times without registering what it said, and has now, in one compressed moment, understood that it was saying something specific and significant, and that he had never once stopped to read it. His expression had not yet arrived at guilt. It was earlier than that, a kind of arrested recognition, a reaching for a framework that had not yet formed, but was forming in real time, visibly, on his face. I did not explain. I did not soften it or smooth it over or give him something to hold on to make the moment more manageable. I held his gaze. I let him look at my sleeve for as long as he needed. The drive home from Coronado was quiet in the way that only very loud silences can be. Greg drove. Donna sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded in her lap, which is what she does when she is working through something slowly and carefully. Jake and I were in the back seat together. The Pacific slid past on our right, and nobody said anything of substance until we turned east and the water disappeared behind the canyon walls. Then Jake turned to me. He had been sitting with it since Commander Cole walked away, and I could see the specific quality of attention he was applying to it. Not the social geography of what had occurred, which he had understood instantly, but the operational specifics that a newly qualified SEAL would reach for. He had spent 4 years inside the Naval Special Warfare community. He had moved through training pipelines and attended briefings and received orders that originated above his team level. He had heard NSWG 1 referenced as an authority structure in briefings. He had simply never connected the name at the top of that structure to his sister. He said, "Group 1, you command Group 1. I said yes. He was quiet for a moment, and I watched him work through the implications. He said, "For how long?" I said 2 years. He looked out at the freeway. I watched his face move through the calculation, how many readiness standards he had been trained to meet that originated above his team CO. How many pipeline decisions had been set by a command he understood structurally, but had never put a face or a name to. The CO of NSWG1 was a title in a chain of command. He had never considered that it was also his sister's job title. He said, "I didn't know." And I said, "I know." He was the only person in that car who didn't have the option of simply not having asked because the information had been available inside a community he was living in, and he had not thought to look for it. I do not hold that against him. I want to say that clearly. It is, however, its own distinct kind of thing to be invisible to someone who had the tools to find you and simply hadn't thought to use them. Greg spoke when we turned off the freeway. His voice had taken on the careful quality it acquires when he doesn't know how to carry something. He said, "Why didn't you tell us?" I said, "I tried. For about 15 years. Donna said that wasn't fair. I said I had mentioned every promotion, every command assignment, every tour of duty, at every available opportunity for 18 years. I had mentioned them at dinner tables, on phone calls, in cards I sent from deployments. Every mention had received a brief acknowledgement and been followed within minutes by a return to whatever was already in progress, which was almost always something about Jake. My father said they hadn't understood what the promotions meant. I said, "I know. That's what I'm telling you." We pulled into the driveway on Crestfield Drive. Jake's old bicycle was in the open garage, the one with the bent front fork. My father's truck was in the driveway. The commendation certificate was on the wall inside the front door. Nothing had changed in this house in 20 years, except the people inside it. I sat in the back seat and did not move to get out. That evening, after dinner, I asked my parents to sit at the kitchen table. I spoke for 20 minutes without stopping. I told them about Naval Special Warfare Group 1 in concrete and non-technical terms, the SEAL teams under my authority, the thousands of personnel in my command, the deployment cycles, the training pipelines that their son had moved through on his way to the Trident he'd received that morning. I told them that Commander Cole, the officer who presided over the ceremony, was an officer whose annual performance evaluation was reviewed and submitted through my headquarters. I told them that I had been doing this work at escalating levels of authority, with escalating responsibility for people's lives for 18 years, and that the reason I had never explained it was not primarily classification. It was that I had learned, before I was 30, that when I described what I did, the family nodded politely and returned to the active conversation, which was almost always, in some form, about Jake. I was not angry when I said this. I was precise. Precision, when it comes from carrying something carefully for a long time, has a specific quality. It is very still and very clear, and does not require anything from the person receiving it except attention. I was not asking my parents to feel a specific way or perform a specific emotion before the conversation could move forward. I was asking them to hear what I said accurately and carry it forward accurately. Every sentence I had constructed in the last 20 minutes had been built with that goal and no other. This is something I had learned to do in professional settings, to strip communication of the freight that makes it about the communicator's need for a particular response, rather than the information itself. I was applying that skill here, at my parents' kitchen table, speaking about 2 decades of being the person whose work the family had not made room for. And the precision, I think, was what made it land differently than the previous 18 years of indirect attempts. I was not asking them to feel guilty. I was describing what had happened and what I needed from them going forward with the same clarity I would bring to a command brief. And they heard it. I watched them hear it. My father stood up from the table and put his back to the counter. He said I should have been clearer. He said I always talked around my work, and how was he supposed to know? I told him that in the same week, in 2018, that he threw Jake a party in the backyard for intending to someday apply to the SEAL program. I had been selected for Commander of the United States Navy on the first look, a promotion that fewer than half of eligible officers achieve on the first attempt. I told him I had called to share that news, and the call had lasted 4 minutes because he needed to get off the phone to confirm the catering order. He said he had been excited about Jake. I said, I know. I am not asking you to have been less excited for Jake. I am asking you to have also looked at me. My mother was crying quietly, in the way she cries when she is not trying to make something of it. She said she was sorry. She said it was not intentional. I told her I knew that. I told her that harm that comes without a deliberate decision behind it is in some ways harder to sit with than the kind with a clear author, because there is no discrete moment to point to, no architect to forgive or confront. What my family had done was reflexive, comfortable, and decades long, and the fact that they hadn't chosen it did not make it less complete, did not mean it had cost nothing. I told them I needed the change more than the apology. I asked them to ask, going forward, in the way that actually wants an answer. I put my coffee mug in the sink. I drove back to Coronado at noon with the windows down and the salt air in my face, and I felt the specific relief that comes from having finally said the true version of a thing you have been carrying in approximate form for a very long time. That night, in my childhood bedroom with the faded comforter, I lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling I had stared at for years while I was planning a life my family couldn't picture. Jake's wrestling trophies were on the shelf above the desk. There was no equivalent shelf anywhere in this house for what I had built. I thought about the notebook in the bottom drawer, the research that I had done at 14, in secret, alone, in this room. I had not been hiding from them then. I had been moving quietly and with intention in the direction I had already chosen for myself, in the language of someone who already understood that the choosing was mine to do. What I had not anticipated, at 14 or 17 or 22, was that moving without announcement would eventually be interpreted as not having moved at all, that the silence I had built from years of unanswered attempts to share the life I was living would eventually look, from the outside, like there was nothing to say. I had protected myself with quiet until the quiet became its own obstacle. I lay in the dark with that knowledge and did not sleep for a while, and then I did. I also thought about Jake, lying down the hall in the room he had grown up in, probably not sleeping either. He had entered the same community I had been serving in for 18 years, had been trained within the pipeline I commanded, and had done all of this without ever connecting the professional structure to his sister. I thought about all the briefings he had attended in which NSWG-1 was referenced as an authority structure, an abstract node in a chain of command, and about what it would mean to him now that the node had a name, his sister's name. I thought that this was, in its own strange way, the most specific form of invisibility I had experienced in my entire career. Being present and unrecognized within the institution itself, within the community of the people I commanded, or within the family I had been trying to reach for 18 years, so the work at NSWG-1 did not pause. Yes, and I was grateful for it. I was back at my desk for 0700 brief the following Monday. Commander Ana Rios, my executive officer, walked me through the deployment readiness timeline for SEAL Team 7, equipment certification status, personnel readiness, logistics pipeline. There was a discrepancy in the dive certification count. I reviewed the documentation, asked 2 questions, identified the correction, and issued a revised directive in 4 minutes. The room moved with efficient precision. Everyone in it knew exactly who I was and what I commanded and what the expectations were. It was not ceremony, it was the functional respect of a well-run command in which the people inside understand the authority structure well enough to work inside it without friction. I noticed, sitting at the head of that table on a Monday morning, how profoundly different this felt from the kitchen on Crestfield Drive. In 20 years of commissioned service, I had never felt invisible in a professional room. The work had always seen me clearly. The people I served alongside had always known what I was doing and why it mattered. I had been operating inside that visibility for so long that I had stopped fully registering what its absence at home had been costing. My father called on a Thursday evening, 9 days after the ceremony. I watched his name on my phone and let it ring. I listened to the voicemail afterward from my car in the NSWG-1 lot. He said he had been thinking since the ceremony. He said he'd had lunch with a retired Navy man from his old firehouse, a master chief named Castellano, who had served 28 years, and that Castellano had explained to him, in terms he could follow, what commanding NSWG-1 actually requires and what it actually means in the community. He paused for a long time. He said, "I didn't realize." He called again 3 days later, and his second message was shorter and more direct. He said, "I want to do better. I just need to know how." I sat in my car and listened to it twice. I put my phone in my bag and went back inside. I was not ready yet. I was getting there. My mother sent a card. It arrived in a cream envelope with her neat, schoolteacher handwriting on the front. The handwriting of a woman who spent 30 years writing on whiteboards and grading papers, precise and slightly right-leaning. Inside, she had written that she had found a community online for military parents and spoken on the phone with a woman whose daughter was a Marine lieutenant colonel. This woman had told her she had spent 15 years asking about her daughter's uniform without ever asking about the life inside it. My mother wrote, "I want to know about the life inside it. Just that. No apology preamble, no qualification, no softening. The ask, plain and direct, which is what she is at her best." I read it 3 times standing in my kitchen. I put it on my refrigerator with a small magnet shaped like a starfish that I had bought at a souvenir stand near a port in Bahrain in 2013 and had been moving from apartment to apartment ever since. I could never explain why I'd kept it. Standing in my kitchen holding my mother's card, I thought I finally could. Jake texted on a Tuesday evening, "Can we get coffee this week?" I gave him a time and a place. I was not ready for my father yet. I was ready for Jake. He had tools I didn't have to provide. We met at a place on Orange Avenue near the Silver Strand. Jake was there first. The teams instill a punctuality that does not release even off-duty, a habitual earliness that functions less like politeness and more like a baseline operational condition. He was in jeans and a gray pullover. He looked exactly like our father at 30, except for the stillness in how he sat. The settled quality of someone who has been pushed to the edge of endurance and rebuilt, who no longer needs to perform composure because the composure has become structural. I recognized it from years of working around people who had it. He paid without discussion. He looked at me across the table and said, "I found your bio on the NSWG-1 website 2 days after the ceremony. I don't know why I hadn't looked before." I wrapped my hands around my cup. I said, Most people who know me here don't need to look it up. He nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of that sentence fully. He said, I trained under your command. I qualified under your command. Every standard I met, every pipeline requirement I moved through, it all came from your headquarters. And I thought of you as my sister with the Navy job. I said, I know that. I said, that is exactly what I was. He understood what I meant, that both of those things were simultaneously true, that I was his sister with the Navy job, and I was also the commanding officer of the command 2 levels above his team, and that the second had been true for 2 years without him or our parents having once asked. He asked me to tell him about the work, not the official version, the real one, what a day looks like. I paused for a moment. I thought about how many times I had declined to answer this question at a family table, not for classification reasons, but because I had learned that this particular audience would not receive the answer in a way that made it worth giving. And then I talked for 40 minutes. I told him about the deployment readiness failure I caught in 2023, 6 days before a team was scheduled to push to the objective, a gap in communications interoperability that would have created real vulnerability at the critical point. I told him what the corrective action required, who was in the room, what it cost in time and operational preparation, and what the alternative would have looked like. He absorbed this with the attention of someone who now understood exactly what that gap would have meant from inside a team pushing to an objective. I told him about removing an XO from command, the months of documentation, the specific cost to every person involved, the 2 weeks of broken sleep it required before and after the decision. I told him about the calls I make to families after incidents I cannot describe specifically, what it requires to keep your voice steady when someone on the other end is coming apart in a way that cannot be fixed by anything you say, only held. I told him about budget fights and personnel advocacy and the quiet, unrecorded decisions that determine whether a command is actually safe for the people inside it or only functional. He listened with complete attention. He said, I've been at this for 4 years, and I barely understand the command 2 levels above my team. How did you carry all of that and come to family dinners and just eat? I said, practice. He laughed, the real one. He said he wanted to do better. I told him he owed me nothing specific. I was not wounded by him individually. I was wounded by a pattern he had been part of without designing it, in the way most people inherit family patterns without authoring them. He said, I still want to do better. He asked if he could call me once a week, just to talk the way siblings talk when they aren't navigating around everything else. I said yes. I meant it without reservation. We walked out onto Orange Avenue together. He put his arm around my shoulder, not the way older siblings do, but the way younger ones do when they've gotten big enough that the gesture has reversed, that you are now the smaller one in the posture, even if not in rank. I let him. We walked half a block before he said he had a formation at 1300. I said I had a brief at 1100. He said, same as always. I said, same as always. We split at the corner and walked in opposite directions toward the same base. I walked back toward the base, thinking about what had just happened in that cafe, which was, in a small but real way, the first honest professional conversation I had ever had with a member of my own family. Not the first conversation, we had talked, Jake and I, for years, but the first one in which I could speak plainly about what I did and have the person across the table hold the information accurately, without translation, without the polite but confused nod that had always told me I'd lost the audience within the first sentence. Jake was inside the context. He could hear me. I had not understood until that morning how much I had been rationing myself in family conversations because I had learned so early that the full version wouldn't land. I turned back through the gate and thought, I don't have to ration it anymore. The deployment certification for SEAL Team 7 completed on a Wednesday in the first week of April. The commanding officer presented final readiness matrices at 0700, equipment certification at 96%, personnel at full strength, communications interoperability verified across all platforms. I asked 3 specific questions, reviewed the final documentation package, signed the authorization, and released the room in 11 minutes. After they filed out, I stood at the window in my office, the one that faces the base perimeter with a narrow, visible stripe of the Pacific on the left, and held what I had just authorized for a moment. I have learned to do this deliberately. The decisions that come from that table carry the weight of people who will move, based on them, into environments I have assessed and do not ever find routine. I stood at the window. I held the weight. Then I turned back to my desk. Greg called on a Wednesday afternoon while I was in my car in the base lot, windows down, the afternoon reading stack on the passenger seat. His name appeared on the screen. I let it ring and listened to the voicemail afterward. He said he had driven past the Naval Amphibious Base that afternoon on the long way to a doctor's appointment with my mother, deliberately taking the route along the Strand Road. He said he looked at the main gate as he passed it and, for the first time he could remember, looked at it as a place that was doing something. A place with actual weight and actual consequence that had been sitting 2 miles from his house for 20 years while he drove past it. He paused for a long time. He said, "I drove past your building today. I've driven past it 100 times and I never once thought about what was inside it." Another pause. Then, I didn't ask because I think I was afraid the answer would make me feel like I hadn't paid attention, which is, yeah. The voicemail ended. I sat in the car and played it twice. He was not apologizing. He was confessing something, offering an honest account of a thing he had done for years without knowing he was doing it. It was the most honest thing he had said to me on this subject in years, and it was the first time he had named the gap between us from his side, in his own language, without my having to point to it first. I put my phone in my bag. I also thought about something Greg had said in a particular way. A place that was doing something. He had described the base as doing something. Not as a building he passed, not as a workplace in the abstract, but as a place actively engaged in consequence. He had driven past it 100 times, and on the 101st, he had finally seen it as a place that was doing something. I had been doing something inside it for 20 years. The distance between those two facts was not his fault entirely and was not mine entirely. It was the distance between two people who loved each other and had never found the right shared language. We were going to find it, late and imperfectly, and after a great deal that had already been spent. We were going to find it. I sat in the quiet of the car with the late afternoon sun on the windshield and the base running around me. I was not angry. I was something more complicated than anger and less finished than forgiveness. The feeling of standing at a door that is about to open. Knowing that what's on the other side is real and will require something from both of us. I knew what I was going to do. I just needed one more day. I called Greg on a Thursday morning in the second week of April, 0830, from my office at NSWG1. He picked up on the second ring. We talked about nothing useful for a minute. The weather, Donna's appointment result, something about Jake's training schedule. Then Greg said, "I got your mom's note. About the Navy parent she talked to." I said I knew. He said what that woman had told Donna had helped him find language for something he hadn't been able to name on his own. I said I was glad. Then he said, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. He said, "What does your day look like? Like, today. What are you actually going to do today?" He asked it simply. Without qualification, without the carefully managed hedging of a person managing their own guilt in real time. He just asked. It was a short sentence. It was the most ordinary question a parent can ask a child, and it had taken 18 years to arrive. I told him about the deployment authorization I had signed that week, what it covered, what it authorized, what it meant in terms he could follow because he had spent his career inside a service that goes toward the hard thing, and this was a service that goes toward the hard thing. Just not the kind built around physical courage and burning buildings. I told him about the brief I had in 18 minutes, the XO evaluation I owed by end of week, the afternoon call with the Naval Special Warfare Command flag officer. I told him that every day has the same shape and completely different content, and that I would not trade any of it. I told him it had taken 20 years to earn the office I was sitting in, and that I tried, every day I came through its door, not to take the window lightly. He listened. I could hear him breathing the slow, deliberate breath of a man who has decided to pay full attention and is holding himself to it. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "What was the most important decision you made this week?" I had to think for a moment. I told him about the deployment authorization, that it carried the lives of people I was responsible for into environments I had assessed, that my signature on that document was the final institutional verification before a team moved, that everything I had built over 18 years was in service of being the person qualified to sign it accurately. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That's not a desk job." I said, "It never was." He said, I know that now. He was quiet again. Then he asked, "Did you know the whole time? Did you know that we were missing it?" I said yes. I said I had always known. He said, "How did you sit with that?" I said, "I got used to it for a long time. And then I stopped getting used to it, and then I had this conversation." He made a sound that might have been a laugh. He said, "I'm sorry it took this long." I said, "I know." I meant it without remainder. Then he said, "I think I spent 30 years believing what people did with their bodies was the only kind of brave. I was wrong." I said, "I know, Dad." I said it without edge and without any weight of accumulated grievance behind it. He had been wrong for 30 years. He was right now. Most people don't reach the right now, and the ones who do are carrying something from the distance they had to cross to get there. I could give him that. I had enough left to give it cleanly. I hung up at 0851, 9 minutes before my first briefing. I stood at the window. Jake was in a pre-deployment workup with his team somewhere on the space, moving through his days with the efficient, grounded purpose of someone who has become genuinely excellent at a hard thing. My mother's card was on my refrigerator at home, held up by a starfish magnet from a souvenir stand near a port in Bahrain in 2013. A magnet I had carried from apartment to apartment for 13 years and never understood why I kept. Outside the window, the base was running, the Pacific beyond the perimeter flat and bright in the April morning, the same water I had been measuring my life against since I was 6 years old, tracing my father's commendation certificate in the hall on Crestfield Drive. I thought about what the recruiter told me at the college fair when I was 17. Most people leave here knowing exactly who they are. I had known exactly who I was before I walked into that gymnasium. I had been carrying the knowledge with the patience of someone who understands, even at 17, that the people you love need more time than you do to arrive at the person you already are. My father had been looking at a 4-stripe sleeve since March, and I had been waiting, without knowing I was waiting, for what it would become. It had become a Thursday morning phone call. A simple question asked simply, a real answer given in kind. That was not nothing. It was not the story I would have written when I was 6 in that hallway, but it was ours, and it was true, and I was fully in it. There are things I do not carry lightly, and one of them is the specific quality of a relationship repaired late. Repaired not because it was broken by a single event, but because it had been slowly shaped by years of small omissions, small deflections, small choices to fill the available time with the easier version of conversation. The repair is not dramatic. It does not feel like the movies make it feel. It feels like a Thursday morning phone call, like a father asking a simple question and a daughter answering it, like the particular quiet of two people who have finally found the correct frequency after years of transmission noise. I am not sentimental about this. I am simply grateful that it happened and that we are both still here for it to happen too. My aide knocked on the doorframe. "Ready when you are, ma'am." I picked up my folder. I walked into the brief. The work continued as it has always continued, without needing the story that surrounds it. I was glad to be in it. I am still glad. Watching Derek pin that Trident was one of the best moments of my life. I'm not going to pretend that what my dad said didn't sting. It did. But I also know that his assumptions were never really about me. They were about a version of me he stopped updating decades ago. What I keep thinking about is how many of us carry that, people in our lives who filed us under a label and never looked again. If that's you, I just want you to know. The work you're doing in the dark is real, whether or not anyone's watching. If this one meant something to you, leave a comment and tell me your story. I read every single one. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit subscribe and the bell.